All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Shafiqa Hashash. On behalf of NYU Students for Justice in Palestine, we welcome you to our largest event for Israeli Apartheid Week. Israeli Apartheid Week is a global effort where universities educate their campuses and their public on the oppression of Palestinians, on institutionalized racism, on occupation, on blockades, and systematic discrimination that fits the definition under international law of apartheid. Students for Justice in Palestine groups in particular exist nationwide to educate and help end Palestinian oppression.
Our next speaker, Chris Hedges, began his career reporting the war in El Salvador. Following 6 years in Latin America, he took time off to study Arabic and then went to Jerusalem and later to Cairo. He spent 7 years in the Middle East, most of them as the bureau chief there for the New York Times. Afterward, he joined the Times investigative team and was based in Paris to cover Al-Qaeda. He left the Times after being issued a formal reprimand for denouncing the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq. In addition to writing a weekly original column for Truthdig, he has written for Harper's Magazine, The New Statesman, The New York Review of Books, Adbusters, Granta, Foreign Affairs, and other publications.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks for the students who organized this. When I lived in Jerusalem, I had a friend who confided in me that as a college student in the United States, she would attend events like these, write up reports, and submit them to the Israeli consulate for money. And it would be naive to assume that this Israeli practice has ended. So I want first tonight to address that person or those persons who may have come to this event for the purpose of reporting on it to the Israeli government. I would like to remind them that it is they who hide in the darkness, and it is we who stand in the light. It is they who deceive. It is we who openly proclaim our compassion and demand justice for the Palestinians. We are not afraid to name names. We are not afraid to name our beliefs. And we know something you perhaps sense with a kind of dread. As Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And that arc is descending with a righteous fury that is thundering down upon the Israeli government. You may have the bulldozers, planes, and helicopters that smash houses to rubble, the commandos who descend from ropes on ships and kill unarmed civilians on the high seas, the vast power of the state behind you. We have only our hands and our hearts and our voices, but note this well. It is you who are afraid of us. We are not afraid of you. We will keep working and praying, keep protesting and denouncing, keep pushing up against your Navy and your Army with nothing but our bodies, until we prove that the force of morality and justice is greater than hate and violence. And then, when there is freedom in Palestine, we will forgive you. We will ask you to break bread with us. We will bless your children, even if you did not find it in your heart, to bless the children of those you occupied. And maybe it is this forgiveness, maybe it is the final, insurmountable power of love which unsettles you the most. And so tonight, a night when some seek to name names and others seek to hide names, let me do some naming. Let me call things by their proper names. Let me cut through the jargon, the euphemisms we use to mask human suffering and war crimes. Closures mean heavily armed soldiers who ring Palestinian ghettos, deny those trapped inside food or basic amenities, including toys, razors, chocolate, fishing rods, and musical instruments, and carry out a brutal policy of collective punishment, which is a crime under international law. Disputed land means land stolen from the Palestinians. Clashes mean almost always the killing or wounding of unarmed Palestinians, including children. Jewish neighborhoods in the West Bank mean fortress-like compounds that serve as military outposts in the campaign of ethnic cleansing, including in East Jerusalem, of the Palestinians. Targeted assassinations mean extrajudicial murder, airstrikes on militant bomb-making posts mean the dropping of massive iron fragmentation bombs from fighter jets or attack helicopters on densely crowded neighborhoods that always leave scores of dead and wounded, whose only contact with a bomb was the one manufactured in the United States and given to the Israeli Air Force as part of our complicity in the occupation. The peace process means the cynical, one-way route to the crushing of the Palestinian people. The battle for justice in the Middle East is our battle. It is part of the vast global battle against the 1%. It is about living rather than dying. It is about communicating rather than killing. It is part of the great battle against the corporate forces of death that reign over us. The fossil fuel industry, the weapons manufacturers, the security and surveillance state, the speculators on Wall Street, the oligarchic elites who assault our poor, our working men and women, our children, one of 4 of whom depend in this country on food stamps to eat. The elites who are destroying our ecosystem with its trees, its air, and its water, and throwing into doubt our survival as a species. What is being done in Gaza, the world's largest open-air prison, is a pale reflection of what is slowly happening to the rest of us. It is a window into the rise of the global security state, our new governing system that the political philosopher Sheldon Wolin calls inverted totalitarianism. It is a reflection of a world where the powerful are not bound by law, either on Wall Street or in the shattered remains of the countries we invade and occupy, including Iraq, with hundreds of thousands of dead. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I lived for 2 of those 7 years in Jerusalem. And one of the greatest purveyors of this demented ideology of violence for the sake of violence, this flagrant disregard for the rule of domestic and international law, is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. AIPAC does not speak for Jews or for Israel. It is a mouthpiece for right-wing ideologues, some of whom hold power in Israel and some of whom hold power in Washington, who believe that because they have the capacity to wage war, they have a right to wage war, whose loyalty in the end is not to the citizens of Israel or Palestine or the United States, but the corporate elites, the defense contractors, those who make war a business, those who have turned ordinary Palestinians, Israelis and Americans, along with hundreds of millions of the world's poor, into commodities to exploit, repress, and control. The United States and Israel have not brought freedom, democracy, and the values of Western civilization to the Muslim world. We have brought state terrorism, massive destruction, war, and death. There is no moral distinction between a drone strike and the explosion of an improvised explosive device, between a suicide bombing and a targeted assassination. We have used the iron fist of the American military to implant our oil companies in Iraq, occupy Afghanistan, unleash proxy wars in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, and ensure that the Muslim world remains submissive and compliant. We fund and unequivocally support a government in Israel that has carried out egregious war crimes in Lebanon and Gaza and is daily stealing larger and larger portions of Palestinian land. We have established a network of military bases, some the size of small cities, in Iraq, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Kuwait, and we have secured basing rights in the Gulf states of Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. We have expanded our military operations in Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Egypt, Algeria, and Yemen. And no one believes, except perhaps us, that we have any intention of leaving. The demonization of Muslims and the willful ignorance of the traditions and culture of the Islamic world reflect our nation's disdain for self-reflection and self-examination. It allows us to perpetuate the illusion of our own moral and cultural superiority. But the world is far more complex than this childish vision of good and evil. We as a nation and a culture have no monopoly on virtue. We carry within us the same propensities for terror as those we oppose. The Muslim Indian emperor Akbar, at the end of the 16th century, filled his court with philosophers, mystics, and religious scholars, including Sunni, Sufi, and Shiite Muslims, Hindu followers of Shiva and Vishnu, as well as atheists, Christians, Jains, Jews, Buddhists, and Zoroastrians. They debated ethics and belief. Akbar was one of the great champions of religious dialogue and tolerance. He forbade any person to be discriminated against on the basis of belief. He declared that everyone was free to follow any religion. His enlightened rule took place as the Inquisition was at its height in Spain and Portugal. And in Rome, the philosopher Giordano Bruni was being burnt at the stake in the Campo dei Fori for heresy. Tolerance, as well as religious and political plurality, is not exclusive to Western culture. The Judeo-Christian tradition was born and came to life in the Middle East. Its intellectual and religious beliefs were cultivated and formed in cities such as Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople. Many of the greatest tenets of Western civilization, as is true with Islam and Buddhism, are Eastern in origin. Our concept of the rule of law and freedom of expression, the invention of printing, paper, the book, as well as the translation and dissemination of the classical Greek philosophers, algebra, geometry, and universities were given to us by the Islamic world. The first law code was invented by the ancient Iraqi ruler, Hammurabi. One of the first known legal protections of basic freedoms and equality was promulgated in the 3rd century BC by the Buddhist Indian emperor Ashkota. And unlike Aristotle, he insisted on equal rights for women and the abolition of slavery. The East and the West do not have separate, competing value systems. We do not treat life with greater sanctity. There are aged survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, along with Vietnamese, Iraqi, and Afghans who can tell us something about who we are as a nation. Eastern and Western traditions have within them varied ethical systems, some of which are repugnant and some of which are worth emulating. But to hold up the highest of ideals of our culture and to deny that these great ideals exist in other cultures, especially Eastern cultures, is made possible only by historical and cultural illiteracy. The civilization we champion and promote as superior is, in fact, a product of the fusion of traditions and beliefs of the Orient and the Occident. And we only advance morally and intellectually when we cross these cultural lines, when we use the lens of other cultures to examine our own. The fantasy of an enlightened West that spreads civilization to a savage world of religious fanatics is just not supported by history. And the worst genocides and slaughters of the last century were perpetrated by highly industrialized nations. Muslims, including Saddam Hussein's brutal regime, have a long way to go before they reach the body count of the secular regimes of the Nazis, the Soviet Union, or the Chinese communists. It was, in fact, the Muslim-led government in Bosnia, when I was in Sarajevo, that protected minorities during the war, while the Serbian Orthodox Christians carried out mass executions, campaigns of genocide, and ethnic cleansing that left over 250,000 people dead. Those who externalize evil and seek to eradicate that evil through violence, as we are doing, lose touch with their own humanity and the humanity of others. They cannot make moral distinctions. They are blind to their own moral corruption. In the name of Western civilization and high ideals, in the name of reason and science, they become monsters. And we will never free ourselves from the self-delusion of our war on terror until we first vanquished the terrorist within. Let us not forget that deep inside our secret world of offshore penal colonies, black sites, and torture and interrogation centers, we practice the cruelty and barbarity that always accompanies unchecked imperial power. There were scores of graphic pictures and videos from the prison in Abu Ghraib that were swiftly classified and hidden from public view. And in these videos, as Seymour Hersh reported, mothers who were arrested with their young sons, often children, watched in horror as their boys were repeatedly sodomized by US soldiers. This was filmed. And on the soundtrack, you hear the boys shrieking. And the mothers were smuggling notes out to their families saying, "Come and kill us because of what is happening." It is we who legitimize the Mahmoud Ahmadinejads, the suicide bombers, and the radical jihadists. The longer we drop iron fragmentation bombs and seize Muslim land, the longer we kill with impunity, the more these monsters, reflections of our own distorted image, will proliferate. If you gaze into the abyss, Nietzsche wrote, the abyss gazes into you. And let me speak for a moment about Iran. I am no friend of the Iranian regime, which helped create and arm Hezbollah, is certainly meddling in Iraq, has persecuted human rights activists, gays, women, and religious and ethnic minorities, embraces racism and intolerance, and uses its power to deny popular will. And yes, it is a regime that appears determined to build a nuclear weapon, although I would stress that no one has offered any proof this is occurring. I have spent time in Iranian jails. I was once deported from Tehran in handcuffs. But I do not remember Iran orchestrating a coup in the United States, as we did in 1953, to replace the elected government of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh with a brutal dictator who for decades persecuted, assassinated, and imprisoned democracy activists. I do not remember Iran arming, and funding a neighboring state to wage war against our country. Iran never shot down one of our passenger jets, as did the USS Vincennes, nicknamed Robo-Cruiser by the crews of other American vessels, when in June 1988 it fired missiles at an Airbus filled with Iranian civilians, killing everyone on board. Iran is not sponsoring terrorist strikes within the United States, as our intelligence services and the Israeli intelligence services currently do in Iran. We have not seen 5 of our top nuclear scientists since 2007 murdered on American soil. The attacks in Iran include suicide bombings, kidnappings, beheadings, sabotage, and targeted assassinations of government officials and other Iranian leaders. What would we do if the situation were reversed? How would we react if Iran carried out similar acts of terrorism against us? The greatest favor we can do for democracy activists in Iran, as well as in Iraq, Afghanistan, the Gulf states, and the states that dot North Africa, is to withdraw our troops from the region and begin to speak to Iranians and the rest of the Muslim world in the language of diplomacy, respect, and mutual interests. The moment we pull our support from Israel, and this will only occur when we implant a successful economic boycott of Israel, as we did to the apartheid regime in South Africa, is the moment when there will be a negotiated peace with the Palestinians. The longer we cling to the doomed doctrine of permanent war, the more we give credibility to the extremists who need, indeed yearn for, an enemy that speaks in the same crude slogans of nationalist cant and violence. The louder the Israelis and their allies in Washington call for the bombing of Iran to thwart its nuclear ambitions, the happier are the morally bankrupt clerics in Tehran who are ordering the beating and murder of democracy activists. We may laugh when crowds supporting Ahmadinejad call us the great Satan, but there is a very palpable reality that informs the algebra of their hatred. And since even the most optimistic scenarios say that any strike on Iranian nuclear installations will at best set back Iran's alleged weapons program by only 3 or 4 years, we can be sure that violence will beget violence, just as fanaticism begets fanaticism. The hypocrisy of this vaunted moral crusade is not lost on those in the Middle East. Iran signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Pakistan, India, and Israel did not, and developed nuclear weapon program in secret. Israel now has an estimated 400 to 600 nuclear weapons, and the word Dimona, the name of the city where the nuclear facilities are located in Israel, is shorthand in the Muslim world for the deadly Israeli threat to Muslim existence. What lessons did the Iranians learn from our Israeli, Pakistani, and Indian allies? Given that we are actively engaged in an effort to destabilize the Iranian regime, given that we use apocalyptic rhetoric to describe what must be done to the Iranian regime, and given that Israel could obliterate Iran many times over, what do we expect from the Iranians? On top of this, the Iranian regime grasps that the doctrine of permanent war entails making preemptive and unprovoked strikes. And they know that if Iraq, like North Korea, had had a bomb, they would have never suffered American invasion and occupation. Those in Washington and Jerusalem who advocate attacking Iran, knowing as little about the limitations and chaos of war as they do about the Middle East, believe they can cripple nuclear production and neutralize the 850,000-man Iranian army. They should look closely at the 2006 Israeli air campaign in southern Lebanon, which saw Hezbollah victorious and united most Lebanese behind the militant Islamic group. If the massive Israeli bombing of Lebanon failed to pacify 4 million Lebanese, How can we expect to pacify a country of 70 million people? But reality never seems to impinge on the neoconservative universe or the efficacy of its doctrine of permanent war. I've watched over the years as these neoconservatives have meddled disastrously in the Middle East. The support by neoconservatives of the Israeli right, and I covered Yitzhak Rabin's 1992 campaign for prime minister, when prominent AIPAC donors poured money and resources into Likud to defeat Rabin, is not in the end about Israel. It is about advancing this perverted ideology. Rabin detested these neoconservatives. When he made his first visit to Washington, after being elected prime minister, he dismissed requests from AIPAC and the Jewish lobby for a meeting by telling one of his aides, "I don't speak to scumbags." Israeli neoconservatives, like our own neoconservatives, hide behind the rhetoric of patriotism, national security, and religious piety. But they are not wedded to any discernible doctrine other than force. They, like all rabid nationalists, are stunted and deformed individuals, only able to communicate in the language of self-exaltation and violence. The nationalist is by definition an ignoramus, the Yugoslav writer Danilo Kish wrote. Nationalism is the line of least resistance, the easy way. The nationalist is untroubled. He knows or thinks he knows what his values are, his. That's to say national. That's to say the values of the nation he belongs to, ethical and political. He is not interested in others. They are no concern of his. Hell, it's other people, other nations, another tribe. They don't even need investigating. The nationalist sees other people in his own image as nationalists. AIPAC, in the end, does not drive Middle Eastern policy in the United States. I'm afraid it is worse than that. AIPAC is one of an array of powerful and well-funded neoconservative institutions that worship force and drive our relations with the rest of the world. These neoconservatives choose an enemy, and then our compliant class of journalists, specialists, military analysts, columnists, and television commentators line up to serve as giddy cheerleaders for war. Moments like these always make me embarrassed to be a reporter. Our political elite, Republican and Democrat, find in this ideology a simple, childish allure. This ideology does not require cultural, historical, or linguistic literacy. It reduces the world to black and white, good and evil. The drumbeat for war with Iran, sounded by AIPAC, is part of this broad, sick, binary vision of a world that can be subjugated by force, a world where all will be made to kneel before the corporate and neoconservative elites, where none, including finally us, will be permitted to whisper dissent. Preemptive war, under post-Nuremberg laws, is defined as a criminal act of aggression. George W. Bush, whose disregard for the rule of law was legend, went to the UN for a resolution to attack Iraq, although his interpretation of the resolution as justifying the invasion of Iraq had dubious legal merit. But in this current debate over war with Iran, that pretense of legality is ignored. Where is Israel's UN resolution authorizing it to strike Iran? Why isn't anyone demanding that Israel seek one? Why does the only discussion in the media and among the political elite center around the questions of, will Israel attack Iran? Can it successfully carry out an attack? What will happen if there is an attack? The essential question is left unasked. Does Israel have the right to attack Iran? And here the answer is very, very clear. It does not. These neoconservatives were too blind and too enamored of their own power to see what invading Afghanistan and Iraq would trigger. So too are they unable to comprehend the regional conflagration that would be unleashed by attacking Iran. What it would mean for us, for Israel, for our allies, and for tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of innocents. Where there's no vision, the people perish, the Bible warns. And since our elites have no vision, it is up to us. The uprisings from Tunisia to Egypt to Greece to Occupy Wall Street are the same primal struggle for sanity, peace, and justice, for a world wrenched free from the grip of those who would destroy it. And the abject fawning by our political elite, including Barack Obama, before AIPAC and its bank account, is yet another window into the moral bankruptcy of our political class, another sign that the formal mechanisms of power are useless and broken. Civil disobedience is all we have left. It is our patriotic duty. We are called to make the cries of mothers, fathers, and children in the squalid refugee camps in Gaza, in the suburbs of Tehran, in the bleak industrial wastelands in Ohio heard. We are called to stand up before these forces of death, the purveyors of violence, those whose hearts have grown cold with hatred. We are called to embrace and defend life with intensity and passion if we are to survive as a species, if we are to save our planet from the ravages of corporate greed and the specter of endless feudal war. The failure of the United States to halt the slow motion ethnic cleansing of Palestinians by Israel is having consequences. The failure to acknowledge the collective humiliation and anger felt by most Arabs because of the presence of U.S. troops on Muslim soil, not only in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in the staging bases set up in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, is having consequences. The failure to denounce the repression, including the widespread use of torture, censorship, and rigged elections wielded by our allies against their citizens in the Middle East, is having consequences. The Muslim world does not see us as we see ourselves. The Muslim world sees us as we are. Muslims are aware, while we are not, that we have murdered hundreds of thousands of Muslims in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. We have terrorized families, villages, and finally nations. We send drones to circle overhead and deliver death from the sky. We enable and defend the Israeli war crimes carried out against Palestinians and the Lebanese. Indeed, we give the Israelis the weapons and diplomatic cover to carry out the slaughter against a people who have no army, no navy, no air force, no tanks, no heavy weapons, no command and control. And we dare to call this a war. It is not a war. It is murder. And those who orchestrate such occupations fail to grasp the terrible rage born of long humiliation, indiscriminate violence, and abuse. A mother or a father whose child dies because of a lack of vaccines or proper medical care does not forget. A boy whose ill grandmother dies while detained at an Israeli checkpoint does not forget. A family that loses a child in an airstrike does not forget. All who endure humiliation, abuse, and the murder of family members do not forget. This rage becomes a virus within those who eventually stumble out into the daylight. And is it any wonder that 71% of children interviewed at a school in Gaza said they wanted to be a martyr? The cliche that Israel has a right to defend itself from Hamas rocket attacks, that bombs and rockets were flying between Israel and Palestinians in Gaza, is accepted by our press as an undisputed truth. It becomes the starting point for every hollow discussion about the conflict. Television pundits and newspaper columnists chatter about proportionality and ignore legality. Israel stands in flagrant violation of international law, specifically Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which calls on an occupying power to respect the safety of occupied civilians. But you would not know this from the U.S. press reports. We callously dismiss the dead as collateral damage, and when those who are fighting against occupation kill us, or Israelis, we condemn them regardless of the context as terrorists. And our hypocrisy is palpable on the Arab street. Most Arabs see bloody and disturbing images every day from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, images that are censored on our own television screens. And they have grown sick of us. They have grown sick of the Arab regimes that pay lip service to the suffering of the Palestinians but do nothing to intervene. They have grown sick of being ruled by tyrants who are funded and supported by Washington. And yet, for all this justifiable revulsion and anger, most in the Muslim world wait, once we cease occupying their land, to make peace. The Palestinian poet Taha Muhammad Ali captured this in his poem titled Revenge. At times, I wish I could meet in a duel the man who killed my father and raised our home, expelling me into a narrow country. And if he killed me, I'd rest at last. And if I were ready, I would take my revenge. But if it came to light, when my rival appeared, that he had a mother waiting for him, or a father who'd put his right hand over the heart's place in his chest whenever his son was late, even by just a quarter hour for a meeting they'd set, then I would not kill him, even if I could. Likewise, I would not murder him if it were soon made clear that he had a brother or sisters who loved him and constantly longed to see him, or if he had a wife to greet him and children who couldn't bear his absence and whom his gifts would thrill, or if he had friends or companions, neighbors he knew, or allies from prison or hospital room, or classmates from his school asking about him and sending him regards. But if he turned out to be on his own, cut off like a branch from a tree, without a mother or father, with neither a brother nor sister, wifeless, without a child, and without kin or neighbors or friends, colleagues or companions, then I'd add not a thing to his pain within that aloneness, not the torment of death and not the sorrow of passing away. Instead, I'd be content to ignore him when I passed him by on the street, as I convinced myself that paying him no attention in itself was a kind of revenge. And if these words are what it means to be a Muslim, and I believe it does, name me too a Muslim, a follower of the Prophet, peace be upon him. The U.S. boat to Gaza, commanded in international waters by the Israeli Navy, was named the Audacity of Hope. But these were not Barack Obama's words. These were the words of my friend, the Reverend Jeremiah Wright. They were borrowed words. And Reverend Wright is not afraid to speak the truth, not afraid to tell us to stop confusing God with America. We bombed Hiroshima and we bombed Nagasaki, and we nuked far more than the thousands killed in New York and the Pentagon, and we never batted an eye, Reverend Wright said. We have supported state terrorism against the Palestinians and black South Africans, and now we are indignant because the stuff we have done overseas is now brought right back into our own front yards. America's chickens are coming home to roost. Or the words of the great Palestinian scholar Edward Said. Nothing, in my view, is more reprehensible than the habits of mind in the intellectual that induce avoidance, that characteristic turning away from a difficult and principled position, which you know to be the right one, but which you decide not to take. You do not want to appear too political. You are afraid of seeming controversial. You want to keep a reputation for being balanced, objective, moderate. Your hope is to be asked back, to consult, to be on a board or prestigious committee, and so to remain within the responsible mainstream. Someday you hope to get an honorary doctorate, a big prize, perhaps even an ambassadorship. For an intellectual, these habits of mind are corrupting par excellence. If anything can denature, neutralize, and finally kill a passionate intellectual life, it is the internalization of such habits. Personally, I have encountered them in one of the toughest of all contemporary issues, Palestine, where fear of speaking out about one of the greatest injustices in modern history has hobbled, blinkered, muzzled many who know the truth and are in a position to serve it. For despite the abuse and vilification that any outspoken supporter of Palestinian rights and self-determination earns for him or herself, the truth deserves to be spoken, represented by an unafraid and compassionate intellectual. And some of the final words of Rachel Corrie to her parents. I'm witnessing this chronic, insidious genocide, and I'm really scared and questioning my fundamental belief in the goodness of human nature. This has to stop. I think it is a good idea for us all to drop everything and devote our lives to making this stop. I don't think it's an extremist thing to do anymore. I still really want to dance around to Pat Benatar and have boyfriends and make comics for my coworkers. But I also want this to stop. Disbelief and horror is what I feel. Disappointment. I am disappointed that this is the base reality of our world and that we, in fact, participate in it. This is not at all what I asked for when I came into this world. This is not at all what people here asked for when they came into this world. This is not the world you and Dad wanted me to come into when you decided to have me. This is not what I meant when I looked at Capitol Lake and said, "This is the wide world and I'm coming to it." I did not mean that I was coming into a world where I could live a comfortable life and possibly with no effort at all exist in complete unawareness of my participation in genocide. More big explosions somewhere in the distance outside. When I come back from Palestine, I probably will have nightmares and constantly feel guilty for not being here, but I can channel that into more work. Coming here is one of the better things I've ever done. So when I sound crazy, or if the Israeli military should break with their racist tendency not to injure white people, please pin the reason squarely on the fact that I am in the midst of a genocide which I am also indirectly supporting and for which my government is largely responsible. And if this is what it means to be a Christian, and I believe it does, to speak in the voice of Reverend Jeremiah Wright, Edward Said, or Rachel Corrie, to remember and take upon us the pain and injustice of others, then name me a Christian, a follower of Jesus Christ. And what of the long line of Jewish prophets that run from Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Amos to Hannah Arendt, who reminded the world when the state of Israel was founded that the injustice meted out to Jews could not be rectified by an injustice meted out to the Palestinians? What of our own prophets, Noam Chomsky or Norman Finkelstein, outcasts like all prophets? What of Uri Avneri or the Israeli poet Aharon Shabtai, who writes in his poem Ripon, the Polish town his father escaped from during the pogroms, these words: "These creatures in helmets and khakis, I say to myself, aren't Jews in the truest sense of the word. A Jew doesn't dress himself up with weapons like jewelry, doesn't believe in the barrel of a gun aimed at a target, but in the thumb of the child who was shot at, in the house through which he comes and goes, not in the charge that blows it apart. The coarse soul and the iron fist he scorns by nature. He lifts his eyes not to the officer or the soldier with his finger on the trigger, but to justice. And he cries out for compassion. Therefore, he won't steal land from its people and will not starve them in camps. The voice calling for expulsion is heard from the hoarse throat of the oppressor, a sure sign that the Jew has entered a foreign country and, like Umberto Saba, gone into hiding within his own city. Because of voices like these, Father, at age 16 with your family, you fled Ripon, and here, Ripon is your son. And if to be a Jew means this, and I believe it does, name me a Jew. Name us all Muslims and Christians and Jews. Name us as human beings who believe that one of us suffers, all of us suffer, that we never have to ask for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for us all, and the tears of the mother in Gaza are our tears. The wails of the bloodied children in Al-Shifa Hospital are the wails of our own children. And let me close tonight with one last name. Let me name those Israeli leaders and generals, along with their American supporters, who send these tanks and fighter jets to bomb the concrete hovels in Gaza, with families crouching, helpless inside. Let me name those who deny children the right to a childhood and the sick a right to care, those who torture, those who carry out assassinations in hotel rooms in Dubai or on the streets of Gaza City, those who deny the hungry food, the oppressed justice, and foul the truth with official propaganda and state lies. Let me call them, not by their honorific titles and positions of power, but by the name they have earned for themselves by draining the blood of the innocent into the sands of Palestine. Let me name them for who they are: terrorists. Thank you.